Hi, Mr. Bingham. So the book that I chose to read for my capstone project was called Dinner at the Homesick Restaurant by Anne Tyler, and ultimately it's the story of a family. And the Tulls consist of Pearl and her three children, Cody, Ezra, and Jenny. And their father, Beck, leaves very early on in the novel, very early on in the lives of the children. And throughout the story, Pearl's character is pretty perfectionistic and she's pretty strict. And after her husband leaves, she sort of spends the rest of her life pretending that everything is fine, that everything is perfect. She tries to kind of be this perfect mother and this perfect role model, but really ultimately has lots of fits of rage and aggression that she acts out towards her children. Cody is the oldest son, and his story, when we first get to meet him, it begins before Beck leaves, and one of the major traits that he has is competitiveness and jealousy, and he experiences it with kind of all of the members of his family and with different people in his life, but primarily he experiences it with his younger brother Ezra, who he perceives to be the favorite of the two of them. And Ezra, on the other hand, is very quiet, he's a very soft soul. He starts working at this restaurant and becomes very close with the owner, Mrs. Scarlatti, and he's sort of seems like he's seeking out a more compassionate, understanding mother-type figure. And when she dies, he takes on this restaurant and he calls it the Homesick Restaurant because he wants it to be kind of a customizable menu for anyone that walks in, that no matter who it is, they can come in and have a taste of home kind of thing. And finally, Jenny, who's the youngest, is treated the harshest by her mother, kind of takes the blunt force of the anger and the aggression. And has several failed marriages before finally becoming a pediatrician and settling down with a husband who has like 6 kids from a previous marriage. So I think that in terms of like the sort of writing style of the book, each chapter comes from a different one of their points of view. And each one seems to be kind of a self-contained story within each chapter. And yet when they're read all together, you really get to see their whole lives. You get to see each character and how they are separate and also together. Throughout the course of the book, and there's a fairly equal like splitting of the narration between them, and so there's not really one character that dominates it all. They're kind of equally authoritative to the telling of the story, which I think is really important because we get to have sympathy for each of them. It makes the story really about all of them. It's not, I mean, the book is called The Homesick Restaurant after Ezra's restaurant, but the story is not about Ezra. It's not about only Pearl. It's about kind of all of them all together. So for my project, I decided to draw out a mind map and then kind of talk through it, I guess. Really focusing on something that I saw Tyler doing a lot in the novel, which was like her use of paradoxes or contradictions and ironies within different symbols in the book, but also within her characters. So first of all, with the major themes, one of the major themes that I saw in the book was kind of this idea of time and of memory. And from the way that time changes from chapter to chapter, first of all, the book starts with Pearl on her deathbed. She's old and she can't see and she has some memory issues. And in that chapter, it starts with her being old and it ends with her going sort of back in time and remembering her life before kids, when she met Beck and the whole transition of getting married. And the next chapter starts with Cody as a young boy, and the time throughout the story is linear, but it's chopped up, and it happens in different breaks. So from that idea, from the way that the time is in the actual writing of the story, but also there's this obsession that Cody seems to have with time, and the fluidity of it, the freeness of time, and I think that comes up in a lot of different ways throughout the book, when they start to feel kind of constrained or trapped. And then I think that time and memory go really well together in the way that each child sort of uses their memories of their past to build their lives. And like, for example, the memory of their mother. Ezra knows that she isn't perfect, but he was one of the children. He never saw her as a villain or a witch the way that Jenny did, for example. And so he sort of ends up staying with her and helping her while they kind of move away early. And they also sort of decide, using those memories of their childhood, they sort of decide what to keep and what to remove from their lives. So Cody, for example, lives almost the exact same life that his father did. He travels for work, he moves his family around from place to place, and he essentially gives his son the same life that he had, except that he adds a father, where he didn't have one. And Jenny, on the other hand, tries to remove the abuse of her mom. She tries to take that part out of her life. Out of her new life, but she ends up actually channeling that and does at one point hit her little girl. But I think that Jenny also adds a lot of emotion to her life because growing up they didn't acknowledge the emotional traumas like her dad leaving. Their family kind of really didn't talk about that. And so, but after she hits her little girl, she kind of has a breakdown, and she lives with her mother again for a time, and healing takes place, and those emotions are acknowledged and really talked about later on in the novel. But ultimately, like I said earlier, one of the main things that I noticed and that I want to discuss about Tyler's work is really her use of contradictions and paradoxes, and kind of why it is that she creates these.
So actually the first contradiction or paradox that I kind of see in the novel actually is within the title itself, in the way that homesick can mean different things. And for me, at least, when I first picked up the book, I understood homesick as sick for home, which I think is a way a lot of people understand it because it's how it's most used. And I think that's also the way that Jenny feels in the book, is that she's homesick. She wants a mother and love and have that kind of feeling and of a family, and that's why she really searches for in her life. And so that's why homesick comes from that. But I think that homesick can also mean different things in the way that Ezra can feel like he's sick at home. He's so sick of being, he's never married and he's sort of lived in the same house with his mom his entire life, and he's sick of being there. And then Cody, I think, can see that as being sick from home and wanting to get as far away as possible. And I think that that Tyler is doing this in a way to create a tension already from the start, in the way of how each of the characters understands the word homesick and how home means so many different things to different people, even within a family. The next tension that I see in the book comes up in food. And first of all, I think that in a lot of ways, in different stories, food can represent a sort of nurturing. And so I guess that in this sense, food comes up as a symbol. Like when Pearl refuses to cook for her kids when they were younger or doesn't feed them, Tyler's also showing that she doesn't emotionally or physically nurture her children. But as a paradox, in Dinner at the Homesick Restaurant, food is present in moments of violence and tension, but also in moments of healing. So Ezra constantly invites his family over for dinner at his restaurant, but the meal always ends before the final course. They fight and they can't seem to have a whole meal together, and there's always tension and conflict coming up between them that cause their connection to kind of break apart before the meal is even over. Another point, Jenny also abuses her daughter during the meal, and it's surrounded around food. A lot of the tension when they're children amongst her mother, when her mother has her outrages, happens at a dinner table. But food is also a major aspect in the healing that Jenny goes through when she moves back in with Pearl after she kind of has her breakdown. And Pearl really does actually use food to nurture and feed her and heal her and take care of her. And the same thing happens with Ruth, who is Cody's wife. She feeds him, and that's kind of how they base their relation at the beginning of their relationship is on food. Then Tyler also, almost more importantly than those other tensions that I've talked about so far, Tyler builds these sort of contradictions within the characters themselves. And I first want to focus on Cody, because Cody is the child who he held the most contention towards his father for leaving throughout the book. He was the most kind of anger at the world and at his family. And I talked about his competitiveness and his jealousy over his brother and all of this really negative angry feelings that he had. But in the end, like I kind of mentioned earlier, he recreates the life he had for his family now. He take all of that anger that he had about moving around and at his father, and he pretty much recreates that life for his son. And at the end of the novel, he is also the person that ends up making peace with his father when he shows up for Pearl's funeral. Because at the end of the book, when Pearl passes away, Beck shows up for the funeral. He was invited. And he's the person that ends up making peace with them, even after all of the hate that he held. Jenny also has these contradictions show up. She's the child who's most affected by her mother's abuse, and she's the one who, throughout her childhood, really feared her mother, especially after her brothers left. But there's a point in her adult life where she gets, so caught up in work and 2 failed marriages and raising a child, and she gets so overwhelmed. And after the breakdown that she has, she moves back home with her mother to heal, the person she was so afraid of, the place she hated. And the place where she feels most safe as an adult is in her mother's home, but that's where she felt the least safe as a child. And finally, I think that there's a tension and a paradox in the image that Pearl projects about her family. She has this idea of a family that's perfect, and that idea that she sees versus the reality of their relationships is a real contradiction within herself. Pearl hides the fact that her husband left her from all her friends and all their neighbors and even her own children. She reflects and lives in this fantasy that her family is perfect, that she's done a perfect job of raising the kids on her own, but in reality their relationships are really broken in a lot of ways, and they're rough and they're not perfect at all. So what is the purpose of all of this? What is Tyler really trying to say? I think, especially when we look at the paradoxes and the ironies within the characters, she's really doing this for the purpose of creating tension, and that tension lets us think about the fact that families themselves are incredibly paradoxical and contradicting in itself. And families can go from being calm and loving to being very angry and full of hatred for one another's very quickly. And I think that this is all kind of shown, or yeah, Tyler, one of the scenes that Tyler really shows this is the final scenes where Cody is sat reflecting about his mother at her funeral. And at first he's very annoyed, and he remembers how she was so particular and how she wished she had made some friends or been like a normal mom and gone out into society, and he was remembering her image and her life with such annoyance and ultimately hatred for who she was and all of that. But in the end, by the end of that reflecting in that chapter, his final memory is of her walking through a field on this one afternoon that they had together. It's very beautiful and it's peaceful. And I think that that change or contradiction in itself in that scene is really what Tyler presents in that moment. It shows how family stories and memories, they can almost be rewritten and changed. And so I think ultimately what Tyler's doing in the book with these tensions that she creates both within her characters, within the scenes, within different symbols, and even within the title itself, she's creating tension to make families, to make the readers think about their own families and really reflect on the reality of those relationships. So in the end, I really enjoyed reading this book. I think that it was one of the most interesting books I've read in terms of how it made me think about my family and the relationships that I have with them, and also just how different I am from my brothers, even though we've had very similar experiences growing up. The way that we've perceived those and the importance that we hold in each of those moments is so different. And I think that's been really fun and kind of like philosophical to think about in a way. And I think I know I've seen this thing about like how your siblings are different versions of you, like how like a version that you could have been. And I've really loved reading Tyler's work. I think that she writes in a really pretty and interesting way. And I'm considering reading more of her books. Ultimately, with this capstone, I would recommend this book to pretty much anyone that wants to read it, because I think it's older and, you know, it's a very, it's not a book that I think a lot of teenagers would be interested in reading, but at the same time, I think that's what is kind of really good about it, is how it made me think about things that I haven't really had to think about before. And those things are very normal things. They're not necessarily like outer worldly or things that don't apply to me, and that's why I haven't thought about them. They're just very everyday. And it's not something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. We don't really spend a lot of time thinking about today. We always are kind of overthinking and worrying and stressing about the tomorrow. And so I've really enjoyed the experience of reading this book and having that time to just really reflect and think about today and my relationships and my family today. And so I've loved getting the opportunity to do that and then be able to kind of talk about the tensions and do that in this video. So thank you.